Good evening and welcome to tonight's program, which is called David Pogue Presents How to Prepare for Climate Change, a Practical Guide for Surviving the Chaos. My name is Kayla Del Biondo. I'm coordinator of programming and outreach at the library, and it's been the library's pleasure to partner with Planet New Canaan to bring you tonight's virtual lecture. So without further ado, we're really excited for tonight's talk, and I'll turn it over to my colleague and friend, Mickey Porta.
Thanks, Kayla, and thanks as always to New Canaan Library for hosting. Planet New Canaan is pleased to bring David Pogue to town tonight. David was the weekly tech columnist for The Times from 2000 to 2013. He's a 5-time Emmy winner for his stories on CBS News Sunday Morning, a New York Times best-selling author, and host of 20 Nova science specials on PBS. David is here to talk with us about his latest book, How to Prepare for Climate Change, which is loaded with resources and specific guidance, and signed copies are available for purchase at Elm Street Books. Thanks for being here, David.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the great intro and for dog-earing your own copy, which you told me about. That warms an author's heart. We are in webinar mode tonight, which means that you can see me and hear me, but I cannot see or hear you. So I'm just going to have to absorb your well wishes and your vibes out there in my imagination land. Tonight's talk is going to be in 2 parts. There's going to be a depressing part at the beginning, and then it's going to get a little shakily reassuring, I like to call it, near the end. I apologize for the terrible photoshopping job on that right-hand mask. I did look on Google for a shakily reassuring mask, and if you've ever wondered what it looks like when Google has no results for your search, that's one. So anyway, I'm sure you've heard about the greenhouse effect. This is an entirely natural effect. It's been going on for millennia. The basic idea is the sunshine heats up the Earth's surface. It bounces back out into space in the form of infrared heat. And we have this thin layer of atmosphere, this blanket of carbon dioxide and methane and other things that traps some of that heat. And we're glad it does, because without this blanket, the Earth would be a frozen ice ball and we would all be dead. What's happening, though, is that blanket is getting thicker as we continue to burn fossil fuels. They call it the greenhouse effect. I personally can't really stand that term. I don't think a lot of people know about greenhouses. I doubt most people have been in one. They don't know that it's 20 degrees warmer inside than outside. I think if you really want to get the public's attention, you'd call it the dog in the car effect, because that's what it really is. It's the same thing: sunshine coming in, infrared heat bouncing off the leather, being trapped by the glass, and we're the dog. So that would be a better term. There's always been rising and falling levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Roughly every 100,000 years, we have this spike. That's all totally normal. What's not normal, if you look at the far right end of this graph, there's been this gigantic spike, much faster and much higher than we've ever had before. And if you zoom in to magnify that graph, you see that it's roughly corresponding to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which is, guess what, when we started burning coal and oil. So if you overlay the Earth's temperature readings on those 150 years, you see there's a pretty good correlation. And this is why they think there's a relationship between the amount of carbon dioxide we're putting out and the rising temperatures. We're putting out 152 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions a day. These are most of where they're coming from. And people say, oh, it's global warming, but I think that's also not a good term, because it's all kinds of domino effect, ripple effect things going wrong. It's freak heat waves and freak cold waves. If any of you know anyone who was in Austin, Texas a couple weeks ago, you know about that historic cold snap in Texas in the spring. It's flooding and it's water shortages. It's massive droughts and intense rains. It's wildfires and hurricanes, biodiversity loss, the explosion of infectious insects, especially here in Connecticut, loss of crops. It's people having to move because they can't live where they did anymore. Those are the things you hear about. But really, it's all these interlocking systems in nature sort of breaking. And some of those are weird effects that you would just never guess. Tornado Alley, you might have heard of, which is that area of the United States that gets all the tornadoes. It's shifting eastward, which is really dangerous because it's shifting into more populous states and a lot of poorer states where the houses are not built very strongly. The changing climate means smaller beaches, more expensive chocolate, more kidney stones, smaller goats, believe it or not, lower PSAT scores, just crazy stuff you wouldn't expect. So I actually think rather than global warming, which is very misleading, I think we need terms like climate chaos or climate breakdown, I've heard. I recently heard someone call it global weirding. I like that one too. Global weirding is pretty good. Anyway, 2020 was a year where we were sort of preoccupied with this pandemic. Most people thought it was a pretty bad year. But the thing is, climate change did not stop changing. The climate chaos continued last year right under our noses. Believe it or not, it was tied for the hottest year ever recorded on the planet. Yay, us. We also reached the world record for the hottest temperature ever measured on the planet. It was in the summer and it was in Death Valley, California. Never seen temperatures that high on the planet. We had the most wildfires. The California and the Northwest saw enough acres burned to cover the entire state of Connecticut and Delaware and Rhode Island put together. And they're saying that that's just the beginning of what wildfire life is going to be out there. We had the most hurricanes ever counted last year. We had so many hurricanes that, you know how they name the hurricanes after boys and girls' names alphabetically? They ran out. They had to go beyond Z. They had to bring in Greek letters to start naming the bonus hurricanes. So the big problem with the Earth trapping the heat like this is that 93% of it is stored in the oceans. And the oceans are an aircraft carrier. They're not a rowboat. They take decades to turn around. So even if we were to stop burning fossil fuels today, and we won't, it would still take the rest of our lifetimes and your children's lifetimes to cool back down. So this is the depressing part. There is zero chance that the climate as we see it is going back to the way it was in, let's say, the 80s. I mean, it is here to stay, what we've wrought. We can do a lot to stop it from getting a lot worse, but we're not going to rewind anything. And part of that is because of the water cycle we learned about as elementary school kids. You know, the clouds, rain, the rain runs into the seas evaporate and make clouds and so on. That cycle is accelerating. As the oceans warm, there's more evaporation and so on. So another part of the changing climate is these crazy rainstorms that are very clearly becoming more frequent, and crazy flooding. I mean, flooding in places you wouldn't expect to flood. Here's the first mind-blowing stat of the evening for you guys. 7 of the 10 most flooded states in this country, as measured by what being defined as federal disaster areas, are not coastal. They're inland states. It's absolutely incredible. This was Washington, D.C. In 2019, they got 6.3 inches of rain in 2 hours. This is Nebraska that same year. 2/3 of the state's counties declared a state of emergency from the floods. And unfortunately, we need Nebraska. Nebraska is the breadbasket. That's where our food comes from. 20 million acres of farms in Nebraska were unplantable that year. Made food prices go up, and it was a terrible disaster for the agricultural industry. This one cracks me up. A little humor to lighten the depression here. This is the tourist attraction known as the Noah's Ark replica. It's in Kentucky, and if you can believe it, that was the year that they filed $1 million lawsuit against their insurance company for flooding. I can't hear you or see you, but I know you're cracking up. This kills me so much. The Noah's Ark replica flooded. We had Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Another side effect of all of these warmer oceans is these gigantic, more violent hurricanes. That one killed 1,800 people. People will be talking about that the rest of their lives. We here on the East Coast enjoyed Hurricane Sandy in 2012, the biggest hurricane ever recorded, 1,000 miles across. And you guys who live in Connecticut, you remember this. I live in Westport, and it was bad. I had 3 little kids. We had no power, no heat, no entertainment, no internet, no TV. You know, and for the first couple of hours, you light candles, you play card games, you talk about how lucky we are to live in this age, you know, and then it's like the 3rd hour. Now what do you do? It got old fast. Anyway, this was New York during Hurricane Sandy. The subways were all flooded. The thing is, Hurricane Sandy level hurricanes used to be freak occurrences, right? They used to come along once every 500 years. By 2017, the average was once every 25 years. And 10 years from now, they're saying we can expect something like that once every 5 years. So the odds of these things are changing. We can't predict what year they'll come, just that they'll come more often. So when you add all this up, the heat, the drought, the fires, the flooding, the mudslides, the storms, it shows in general, there are more disasters happening more often to more people. And that is why I think this survey result says what it says. Yale does this survey of Americans once or twice a year about their attitudes toward the changing climate. And, you know, I hear all the time, well, half the people don't even believe in climate change, you know. And I don't think that's actually true. I think, first of all, we need to define what a climate denier is. I don't think a climate denier is any longer somebody who says the climate is not changing. I mean, all you have to do is look out the window or read the news to know that it's changing. I think these days, the question is how many people believe that we're responsible by burning fossil fuels, or is this just a natural cycle? And in the latest study, which came out in December, we're down to 29% of Americans who say that this is a natural cycle. That's been dropping 5% or so every 6 months. It's a very small number. I mean, it's hard to get Americans to agree on anything, as you know. I mean, we live in an era where 20% of Americans believe that aliens walk among us. So I think we're doing okay with 29%. In any case, for the purposes of my book and this talk, it doesn't matter. I don't care whether you think we're causing climate change or whether you think it's a natural cycle. The point is, it is changing, and we do need to prepare. Thus, the book. So these are what the chapters are. And again, to keep this under that 9-hour limit, I'm just going to give you a choice, select few highlights from the book. The first one, the thing that most people ask me the most often is where to live, because obviously not everybody has the chance to move, but 40 million Americans a year do move for various reasons, and more of them are taking the climate into account when they do that. So I think for those purposes, it's worth considering. It turns out there's nowhere in America that you can live and not be hit by some of the effects of climate chaos. The basic formula is you want to be inland far enough so you don't get flooded. This is a cool website called Surging Seas. You can Google it up. You put in any address, and then you can drag this slider on the left to see what the sea level will be in 2100 or whatever year you choose. So this is where I live. This is Westport. Let me animate this. And you can see if the sea level rises to, let's say, 9 feet up, you can see that a lot of this town is just going away. And people say, well, what's 1 foot of sea level rise? That's not very much. But you got to remember that for every 1 foot up the water goes, it goes inland 300 feet. So that's our basements and our businesses and our homes that are getting flooded. Here's Boston, can run the same experiment. I mean, that's a low-lying city. They've really got some thinking to do. That's 8 feet of rise. And here's Miami. Miami is in deep water. I mean, Miami is going away. It's low-lying, it's porous, you can't build seawalls. In fact, the entire southern tip of Florida is more or less in trouble. Do not do not buy real estate in Miami. They're experiencing now 100 days a year of sunny day flooding. This is flooding just from the high tides when there's not a hurricane, when it's not even raining. The storm grates that are supposed to drain the streets, now the water is coming up through them to flood the streets. This guy, all I can imagine, he's paying the meter for his submarine, because that's what the streets look like 100 days a year. If you buy real estate there, you're in for it, because real estate is already dropping on coastal areas in Florida, and it's supposed to get really bad if the public wakes up to what's happening down there. So in general, you want to be north far enough to avoid the heat waves and the hurricanes. You want to be inland to the west far enough so you don't get the rising sea level. We also don't hear enough about the drought. The western half of this country is in more or less perpetual drought. I mean, you've probably heard about the California one. They've been in drought for a decade now. But I mean, where do we get our water? We get our water from aquifers, which are these big underground water deposits, and those are at record lows worldwide. In the West, they get their drinking water from melting snowmelt, the snow up in the mountains. But now the winters are shorter and warmer. There's not much snow up there to melt. The spring is coming sooner, and so that the water, there's less water to run down, and it runs down sooner. And then we also get water from dams. This is the Hoover Dam Lake Mead. It feeds 25 million people in 3 states. It's a third full, and it's dropped 117 feet in the last 20 years. So you got to think, where am I going to find fresh water? And the answer to all of this is the 42nd parallel, the Great Lakes area. The Great Lakes are far from the hurricanes, they're far from the wildfires, far from sea level rise, far from drought, and they have perpetual, clean, fresh drinking water for the rest of your life and your grandchildren's lives. And the temperatures are moderates, and the winters are, I mean, the winters in Duluth and Madison are cold, but they're getting warmer. I mean, they've warmed up 5 degrees since 1980, and they're supposed to get 13 degrees warmer by 2050. So in the book, I looked at 14 of these cities to see where really you might want to think about retiring or moving, or if you get a job offer, which one to take. And there's more to it than climate, of course. You also want a great place to live. So I also took into account, the cost of living and the cultural amenities. Is there a good airport? How is the parks? How are the people there? In Cleveland, by the way, where I grew up, I was astonished to learn that $1 here buys you $2.71 worth of stuff in Cleveland. I mean, you can be a millionaire without being a millionaire. It's unbelievable. So my favorite town is Madison, Wisconsin. This town, it's on 5 lakes. It is absolutely beautiful. They have a zoning regulation that says no building shall ever be built taller than the Capitol building. It's the capital of Wisconsin. In fact, not even to be built taller than the Capitol building. No building may be built to block the public's view of the Capitol building. So it's never going to be a concrete jungle. Meanwhile, it's been named by every magazine and website, the #1 nicest city, fittest city, bike friendliest city, best city in growing tech jobs, quality of life, and so on. Just a fantastic place. I literally am going to be an empty nester in 2 years, and my wife and I went to look. That's how attracted I am. But Burlington, Vermont, also a fantastic place. My editor at Simon & Schuster, sold her Cape Cod house upon reading this manuscript, and her husband and she bought a place in Burlington based on my book. No pressure. But what's great about Burlington is it's on Lake Champlain, which is this 500-mile freshwater lake. So it feels like a seaside town. It has that spirit, and yet it's not on the ocean, so it doesn't have sea level rise or hurricanes. Great place for maple syrup and ice cream. Lowest obesity rate in the country, lowest crime rate in the country. Very educated, wonderful people who live there. Buffalo, one of the great Rust Belt cities, ready for ready for people to come back. Amazing hospital facilities, and yeah, the chicken wings are really good. So the next chapter I thought I'd give you a quick overview on is where to invest. I know it can seem a little crass to talk about making money when, you know, the world is ending, but there are some solid reasons to consider investing in climate chaos related industries. And the main one is that you're also investing in mitigation. If you're supporting companies that are doing something about the problem, then you are also helping the world while you make money. So because we are here in affluent Connecticut, I thought you might enjoy my thoughts here. If you were to invest in regular energy stocks, you would be doing really poorly. You would have been following that line at the bottom. Whereas the regular stock market, as you know, has been on a tear for the last 11 years. Specifically, if you'd invested 4 years ago in clean energy stocks, your $1,000 would now be worth $1,600. If you'd bought that in fossil fuel stocks, you'd be down 15%. So not a good place to put your money. So the first thing that comes to mind is, well, should we invest in solar power? And I mean, we know that solar power is the future. It's free, unlimited energy. This is a proposed solar farm in Australia. And it is true that solar power is taken off. You can see how much more we're making of it every year. In fact, last year, 70% of the new electricity installed in the US was from solar and wind. And by the way, no new coal plants were built, and there are none planned in this country. Coal is dead in the US. So that's, believe me, that's a good thing. In fact, let's make fun of Kentucky some more. The coal mining museum in Kentucky a couple of years ago actually installed solar panels on their roof to save money. I'll let the juicy irony sink in there. Last year, we celebrated an amazing milestone. Last year, for the first time, renewable power was consumed more in this country than coal. The lines crossed, and that's only going to continue in that direction. That's because solar power has gotten so cheap, you can't believe it. It's gotten this cheap, 20 cents a watt, maybe 80 years sooner than anybody predicted 10 years ago. Nobody guessed it would get this cheap. And that, by the way, is why it's not a good investment. You do not want to invest in a race to the bottom in a commodity where the idea is crank it out as cheaply as you can. I mean, these Chinese firms are cranking out cheaper and cheaper and cheaper solar panels. That's not where you want to put your money. You could say the same for wind. Wind power is really taking off here because it's getting so inexpensive to build. That's why it's not a good investment. But here's a twist. Turns out that an increasing number of states in this country have mandates where they are required to get a certain amount of their energy from renewable sources. In New York, California, and Hawaii, it's 50% of their power by 2030. So what do? You invest in the utility companies that will be selling to them. So NextEra and Xcel are two of the big utility companies that are betting heavily on generating power from renewable sources. So that's where you can think how you might profit from this transaction. We know that clean water, as I've mentioned, is an issue everywhere in the world. So there are investment funds that specialize in water equipment, water purification. We know that the growing area of the United States is getting hotter and drier, and the weather is getting more erratic. So Monsanto and Syngenta, companies like this, are developing drought-resistant seeds. I know those are big, monolithic, evil companies, but they are going to be the winners. In fact, since the Farm Belt is shifting north, I've also heard it said that farming equipment is going to be a big bet, a good place to put your money. John Deere and Navistar and stuff like that. Another thing you might think in terms of investment is electric cars. As you may be aware, every car company now, is moving either partly or completely into electric cars. They're not even going to make gasoline cars anymore, including General Motors. General Motors. Would you in 1,000 years have guessed they're going to stop making gas cars in the next 14 years? They're going to make nothing but electric cars. I mean, this is the most calcified, slow-moving, conservative American corporation there is, and they're going all electric. Could not believe it when I heard it. So where do you invest? Well, you could invest in these individual car companies, but here's the thing. All these countries have so far announced they are going to ban gasoline cars by the years listed here. California will no longer permit them to be sold. That is why all the car companies are going electric, because their customers are all going electric. So what you can do is think farther upstream, invest in the parts that all of the car companies are going to need, right? So they're all going to need lithium-ion batteries. So there's only 4 companies in the world that make them. They're all Asian companies. They're listed here. They are all going to be supplying these batteries. There's never been an American or European battery company startup that succeeded. All these car companies are also going to need components like connectors and wires and copper. Or you can think even farther upstream and think about the lithium itself in those batteries. That has to come out of the ground, and somebody's got to mine it, like these companies here. Those are lithium mining companies that will be doing very well in the next 20 years. Insurance might seem to be the most boring topic in the book. Trust me, it's fantastic. I spent the entire summer of 2019 interviewing insurance people and learning about this. It's really fascinating. And what I can tell you is that you might think that 15 minutes could save you 15% or more on your insurance. 15 minutes is not enough time to get to know your insurance policy. You probably got it to be as cheap as you could, and you renew it every year and you've forgotten all about it. You need to look at it. Things have changed. For one thing, as I mentioned, flooding in this country is a huge problem in the climate chaos era. The number of claims for flood insurance is skyrocketing, and the size of those claims is skyrocketing. And I hope you're sitting down. Your homeowner's insurance does not cover flooding. You at this moment are not covered for flooding. In fact, all the flood insurance companies have gotten out of the business, Allstate and Nationwide. They don't do flood insurance anymore. It's not a good bet for a company. So the only one providing flood insurance in the United States is the government. FEMA offers this thing called the National Flood Insurance Program, the NFIP. And that's where most people get their flood insurance. The program is kind of a mess. It's $25 billion in debt because of all the hurricanes. Their rates are not based on the market or the riskiness of your property. That's what drives experts crazy. They're based on historical flooding numbers from decades ago. So this fall, that's supposed to change. The Congress is going to supposedly approve this new risk calculation system where you will pay for what your property really should be paying according to its risk of flooding. But what cracks me up is everybody's going to hate it, right? The people who've been paying too little all these years, their rates will suddenly jump up and they'll be furious and they'll write their Congress people. And then the people who've been paying too much for all these years, their rates will drop, but they'll be furious because you've been robbing me blind for 30 years. So it's not going to be a fun time in Congress. I don't know what's going to happen to insurance. As you know, in California, they're pulling out. They're dropping customers for fires, and in Texas, Louisiana, Florida, they're dropping customers from flood insurance. They only have 3 levers to pull. They can drop customers, they can raise their rates, or they can leave the state entirely. Some of my experts said insurance is going to wind up being this luxury for rich people because no one will be able to afford insurance building where they build now. So there are chapters in the book on tornadoes, hurricanes, flooding, heat wave, fire, and so on. But I thought I would summarize all of this into one introductory chapter about general disaster preparation. As you know, climate chaos disproportionately affects poorer people and communities of color. So I really didn't want this book to be all about, here's how you can buy your way to safety with money. So these are all pretty much free things that you can think about doing, and you can do them this weekend. First of all, this is a free app. It's just called Emergency. It's made by the Red Cross, and you download this thing, you enter your address, maybe your children's address, your workplace, whatever. Then you can file this app away and forget about it. And the cool thing is, if a disaster is ever coming your way toward one of those addresses, it wakes up, it beeps, it gets your attention. What really breaks my heart, every one of these disasters, the hurricanes, the wildfires, when you hear about people who died in their homes because they didn't get warning. They didn't get the message. They didn't have the TV on at the time. Nobody told them. And so they died in place. This would save your life. I also recommend anyone who lives in a coastal state like Connecticut that you make yourself a go bag or a bug out bag. This is like a backpack you keep by the front door with everything you would need to survive for a couple days outside the house if you were forced to evacuate in a hurry. So it's snacks and water purification tablets and first aid stuff, flashlight, some ID and some money that you should have ready to grab as the last item before you run out the door. Everybody in California has these already. It's time for more people to think about it. And the reason is, you always see those aerial pictures of cars snaking out of town from a disaster. You don't want to be at the end of that line because you took too long to get ready. Another thing that all disasters have in common is the drinking water gets contaminated. That's true of hurricanes and of wildfires. So you may be told, do not drink water out of the tap. This is where the old saw came up about fill your bathtub in advance of the hurricane, but you can do better than that. You actually have a lot of water, clean water, already within the walls of your house. Like you've got 40 or 80 gallons right there in your hot water heater. So when you hear the water is contaminated from the city, you turn the shut off at the top, you open the flow valve at the bottom, you let it pour out into a bucket, let it cool down, you got drinkable water. You've also got clean water in your toilet, not the bowl, unless you're a Labrador. No, I'm talking about in the tank. You've got 3 or 4 gallons right there. That's perfectly potable. And if you have a multi-story house, there's also water in your pipes. What you do is you open the faucet on the topmost floor to let the air in, and now it'll flow out the bottom. So you have drinkable water. You don't have to run to the grocery store and fight with everybody else for bottled water, which is expensive and heavy anyway. Another thing that all these disasters have in common is power failures. The United States is the #1 developed country in power failures. Yay, us. We have more than any other developed country, and it's getting worse. Our grid is old, it's vulnerable, it's really fragile. So there's not much you can do to protect yourself against power failure besides getting a generator. They don't have to be expensive. For 15 bucks, you can get one from Amazon that is hand cranked. It's enough power to recharge your phone, your tablet. It's also got a flashlight and an emergency radio on it. For 250 bucks, you can go to Home Depot and get a gas powered generator. They're loud and they're smelly. You have to keep it far away from the house so you don't breathe it. And you have to keep filling it with gas, which during a Hurricane Sandy situation is problematic because everyone else is trying to buy gas too. There are these inverter generators that are not smelly and not loud. They use a different technology, but they're more expensive. And then, you know, if you live in Fairfield County, you can get a standby generator. These are the permanent ones that are powered by natural gas. They kick in automatically when the power goes out. After Hurricane Sandy, my experience here, we finally got one, but we didn't get a big fancy whole house one. We saved a lot of money by getting a little one. It just powers the kitchen, the living room, and 1 bedroom. I mean, we could handle that for 6 days. And we don't lose our food that way in the refrigerator. So anyway, there are some options for power, but also remember that a lot of these disasters bring down the cellular network. This happens in every hurricane and every wildfire. So I also recommend that this Saturday night over dinner, you plan with whoever is in your family, where would we meet if we weren't allowed to get back into the house and there was a disaster? Have a plan. If our cell phones didn't work, where would we meet? So you want to plan 3 places. You want to plan a place in the house away from windows where if it's a hurricane or a storm, the glass won't cut you to bits. Maybe a upstairs closet or basement. You want to pick a spot nearby, like we'll meet by the craggy tree in front of the Casey's house if you're not allowed into your house. And if you're not allowed access to your street, you need a place in town where you can all meet if someone was at school and someone was at work. So, we'll meet at the library, let's say. And here's a special just for Connecticut residents. Not everybody is unhappy about the changing climate. Mosquitoes and ticks love it because it means the winters don't kill them off. So they are moving northward en masse. Tick territory is expanding really quickly. Number of Lyme disease cases is growing tremendously. Here's a comparison from the CDC. And remember, these are 30,000 cases reported every year. The CDC estimates that only 1 in 10 cases are reported. So it's really more likely 300,000 cases. You really don't want Lyme disease, you guys. It's the worst. There's no good test for it. There are a couple of tests. They're both really unreliable. You don't really know if you have it because it mimics a lot of other things. You can fix it if you've been bitten by a tick and you take antibiotics right away. You can nip it in the bud. But if you don't, you could have these aches and pains and mental fog for the rest of your life. So best to avoid it. Fortunately, there is some good news that I learned through my research on this chapter. This is mind-blowing stuff. First of all, most ticks don't carry disease. So if you have a tick on you, doesn't mean you got Lyme disease. As I mentioned, antibiotics taken early cures Lyme for good. And by the way, you don't have Lyme disease unless that tick has been on you for at least 24 hours. So if you can find it and remove it after your walk, you will never get Lyme disease. I hear people say, oh, the ticks are up in the woods, in the branches, and they're waiting for somebody to walk underneath them and they drop down on you and bite you. Not true. Ticks cannot jump. They cannot fly. They don't even have eyes. What they do is they stand at ground level on the plants on their hind legs and they wait for an animal or you to pass by and they grab on that way. If you don't want to get one, then just use insect repellent with DEET. DEET is very safe. It works great. It's not a poison. It's not a nasty chemical. It just smells bad to the ticks and they avoid you. Also, ticks can't survive in dry conditions. So if the humidity is under 82%, they dry out and die. So for that reason, the experts suggest that you make a 9-foot moat around your house of gravel or lawn or anything but bushes and trees. That is Death Valley to those ticks. They can't cross it because it's too hot and dry in the sun. And that way, none of these ticks will ever reach your patio or your children. And finally, the basic rule is once you've been for a walk, come home, throw your clothes in the dryer for 10 minutes. The heat kills whatever's on them. And while you're standing there naked, look over yourself, look in the hairy parts, and make sure there's no ticks on you. If you get them off within 24 hours, you're good to go. Oh, and if you do see one, don't believe the internet. Don't really believe those things about light a match or Vaseline. Get a pair of tweezers, pluck it out by the head, and that's it. Finally, I mentioned that there was some happiness at the end of this. Here we are. Greenhouse gas emissions are in this country dropping rapidly. Mostly that's because we switched away from coal and more toward fracking, but still they're going down. We did spend 4 years with our president saying that climate change was not a priority, but over 55% of the population, 24 states, said we are still in the Paris Agreement. And these states kept to the emissions targets that they would have had if we were in the Paris Agreement. And that includes a huge number of big corporations that we think of as polluters, but actually they're under a lot of pressure to clean up from investors, from consumers, and even from the employees of the companies themselves. Remember, Amazon didn't even have a climate program 2 years ago, and then their employees sort of had a mutiny. And now Amazon has, they plan to be carbon neutral by 2040. They're buying 100,000 electric vans, spending $10 billion on climate science. All these tech companies have done really impressive things. Microsoft, in fact, they've been carbon neutral since 2012, which means, yes, they're still pumping out carbon dioxide, but they're also removing as much carbon dioxide as they're putting out through things like sponsoring growing forests and paying people not to cut down their forests. By 2050, they intend to have removed all the carbon from the atmosphere that company has ever produced since 1979. It's a fantastic goal. I don't know if they'll do it, but that's what they've said. So in the end, you guys, there are two reasons you want to prepare for climate chaos. The first one is the obvious one, because you'll be ready when something nasty happens out there. Your property will be damaged less, you will be less sick, your children will be safer. But there's a second sort of stealth reason that my editor called this the world's first uplifting book about climate change. She said it made her sleep better at night, because one famous aspect of depression or anxiety is the feeling like you can't do anything about your situation. You're helpless to change things. But by taking steps now to prepare, you are taking action. You are getting yourself ready. You're making yourself resilient. So you do feel better about the whole thing. I do believe that decarbonization will come. We are going to stop using petroleum. I think it'll take 80 years or so. And the reason I think that is these pictures. You just look at the young people and how they care. We're going to die off. These people are going to run the world. And so I think it's quite obvious that what they care about is going to win the day. In the meantime, I suggest that you should prepare. Thank you very much. Sorry again about the technical problems. If the bookstore runs out of books, by the way, and you do buy the book later, I would be happy to mail you an autograph in the form of a sticker like this. Here's my email address for that, or if you have any questions that we don't get to now.
That is great, David. That is great. Thank you so much. Wow, we do have some questions coming in. So are you ready? We'll jump right in.
I'm ready.
Okay. Well, one of the questions is, can you say, you know, whether this data, this science is changing rapidly or slowly? Because in regions like ours that don't seem to be in the highest danger zones, but they're also not entirely free and clear, what should the timeline be? I mean, what have you, okay, so you live in our area, what have you personally done to prepare?
That's a great question. I did a lot working on the book. It kept me awake at night, interviewing all these experts for the book. I've done a lot. We got an electric car. I have not bought gasoline in 2 years. We now have a garden. I did look into my insurance, and I was horrified at what I saw. We were completely insured for the wrong things. We've been here 19 years, and that insurance policy was taken out 19 years ago. So anyway, wound up saving money on that. So there, and then, you know, my habits have changed a lot too. This book is not about mitigation, but I have adopted a lot of mitigation policies. In terms, if you're 80, you know, I don't think you need to worry about your house. You don't need to move. But if you, on the other hand, if you are 80 and you have children who might inherit your home, you might want to think about whether you're leaving them something that's going to be in harm's way. I mean, I don't know how many of you guys were here during Sandy, but it was bad. I mean, we had 6 days without power, and I did not want to be in that position again. So we are in Connecticut. We are in fact on a danger coast. The sea level is rising. 2050, think to yourself, where will I and my descendants be in 2050 when the water level has risen, let's say, up 1 foot and inland 300 feet? There's the answer.
Okay. Is there value in buying farmland in the regions around the Great Lakes? Do these lands have water rights that can add protection? And another Great Lakes question, if everybody moves there, isn't it a dangerous scenario as a homeowner?
You mean because of crowding, I guess?
I guess crowding.
I don't think you need to worry about crowding in the Buffaloes and Duluths and Clevelands. Those, as you may know, those were cities that had their heyday in the 20s during the industrial times. And right now, they're great big yawning expanses of empty open land. They are made to grow. So they will not see overcrowding within several generations. There is, in fact, about the farmland question, there are, in fact, these farm real estate investment trusts. They are, in fact, buying land in the Great Lakes region for that very reason, is because the prices are already going up. People are already recognizing that this is going to be the new growing region. So
Right.
yes, I would think that would be a fantastic investment.
Question about water. In the book, you talk about the idea that we've all gotten very spoiled. We've gotten used to the idea that water is clean, that it's available, and that it's free. In our area, you know, we don't think of ourselves in a desert area, but we experience droughts too. Are we looking at interruptions in our own water supply or rationing in the near future?
I mean, I haven't seen it in the 20 years I've lived here. But
what about with the
will
watering, like the watering of the lawns and all that stuff?
Yeah, in fact, they are saying to cut back, aren't they? Just recently, our Aquarian gave us notices that we want to do the alternating days. Yeah, so it's entirely possible, and you know, it really depends on the erraticness of the weather and whether we have a dry period. But I will say that the price of water is definitely hitting us. It's gone up roughly 50% since, I guess, 1990. So it's no longer being considered a free good.
Okay. Can you speak to the value of community? If you move to a less risky location, you're going to have to rebuild your social network. So do you have suggestions about finding like-minded neighbors or building more resilient communities? And this might actually also go to the idea of eco despair that you talk about in your book. It sounds like there's a mental health component to this question.
Yeah, excellent. Susan, I'm giving you my email address in the chat. There's my email. Yes, so the first chapter of the book is actually called Acclimating to Climate Change, and it is about eco-despair or climate melancholia, which is, believe it or not, an affliction whose diagnosis has been going through the roof in the last 10 years, as you can well imagine. It's people who are despondent about the fact that the earth is changing and not in a good way, and nobody seems to be doing anything about it. Our leaders are not taking action. Obviously, we have a different president now who cares a lot about climate change and is building climate mitigation and adaptation into every department of the government. It's much easier to be optimistic that way. But in terms of moving, for sure, your community and your social circles are a strong reason not to move. I mean, that's a counter argument, because you would have to start over. But I do think of people who are getting out of the military, getting out of college, setting up their first job, or choosing a less nasty place to retire. All of these are situations when you would be moving anyway. So you'd be starting over anyway, leaving your social circle, rebuilding. So of course, there are the usual suggestions for meeting new people in towns. There are, meetups, and by the way, there are a lot of great climate groups in every city. So you could always meet like-minded people that way.
That's great. Someone here writes, a doctor friend recommended using a loofah all over your body to knock off ticks after being outside. And there's other stuff, in this area, we've all heard of West Nile virus and Lyme disease. Are we a little bit jaded about mosquitoes and ticks? I mean, I know you said you don't want to get Lyme disease, but how much more attention should we be paying to this? Should we be doing loofahs and DEETs? Should we be spraying our lawns?
You're probably under caring about West Nile for mosquitoes and Lyme disease from ticks, because the numbers are going up so fast. Yes, we heard about this from old Lyme, Connecticut a couple decades ago, but the numbers are exploding. So spraying is one thing we do a lot for mosquitoes and ticks, but it's It's not fantastic because it also kills a lot of innocent bystander bugs like butterflies and bees and pollinators like that. So
Right.
if you can avoid spraying or spray the least you can, that's
Mhm.
ideal. Really, it's DEET repellent, man. It repels both mosquitoes and ticks. It's one of the most studied chemicals ever made. Is completely safe, even if you're pregnant, whatever. They say, you know, to wear long pants when you go out in the summer and tuck them into your socks. And yes, that will prevent any ticks from getting on you. But as Tom Mather, this fantastic ticks expert at University of Rhode Island, told me, no one ever does it. Like, it doesn't matter how many times we hear it. You're never going to see a kid in the summer tucking his long pants into his socks and looking like a dork.
Right. So get the bug spray. Get that bug spray for camp. A couple more questions since we had those tech snafus in the beginning. I just want to run over by a few minutes. You identified which states might be best located in our country, but will Canada or Siberia be more desirable? Are there other countries that are prepared and well situated geographically?
Yes, Canada, Siberia, and Greenland. There are huge explosions of investments in all three of these places as new agricultural regions. I mean, Siberia? Are you kidding me? Yes, Siberia. They're seeing that as the next global breadbasket. Do you know that Siberia had a 101-degree day last summer? In the frozen tundra of Siberia, 101. I mean, it's all different. They're having horrible wildfires. Greenland has over 100 different companies setting up power plants and agricultural combines there. So yes, these are very much going to be the new farmable areas.
Okay, just two more questions. You mentioned investing upstream, and given some of the US earmarks for green infrastructure, a lot will be coming from China. But given the geopolitical situation, can we trust those imported technologies? Can we rely on them? What's the greater risk and opportunity with tech from China?
I might not totally understand the question. Can we trust the actual products that they're selling us?
Well, I guess, can we trust the products, or can we trust that we're going to be able to get those products? Like, if we're in a trade war, if, you know, should we be afraid? Should we be afraid?
I mean, there's nothing wrong with lowering our dependence on China. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I know a lot of forward-thinking people are setting up manufacturing in the States. You know, Tesla is built entirely in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I don't know. I'm not a geopoliticist.
Okay. I just want to say that we've still got some more questions. David wrote his email in the chat, and he does want you to contact him with questions. We have another question here. You close with hope in the book and where we can find it, and you cite the places where we live. You cite companies and coalitions, renewable energy, carbon neutrality, and also these game-changing science fiction-like technologies that sound like they're out of the Twilight Zone. But how bullish are you really? And can you recommend a couple of ways that we might personally fuel this hope, aside from the obvious things like calling our elected representatives, you know, and voting?
Yeah, that's a super amazing, profound question. How bullish am I really? I'm much more bullish than I was when I started the project, which began out of complete despair and hopelessness, and the world is ending, because there are so many people who care and are working in their own little ways. I mean, so many countries, so many politicians now. It's not a dirty word anymore. The tide has turned. It's turned way too late. Like, that's the problem. Like, we should have done this in the 80s when, you know, when scientists first started raising the alarm. So we're, you know, 40 years behind where we should be. But I do believe that, I mean, it's quite obvious that never in history have so many people been working on a problem. And we have done this before, right? Remember the ozone layer, the hole in the ozone layer? We fixed that just by the same government and community action. Remember leaded gasoline? We fixed that. So we have fixed big, natural system problems before that we've caused. And we have some things like the price of solar and wind at our back. I mean, those are really making coal and oil look like bad bets. So that's fantastic. So I have no hope that we're going to rewind to the earth of my childhood. But I'm definitely very sure that we're not going to reach the worst of the predictions in the IPCC, the United Nations Climate Group's predictions from a couple of years ago, where they talked about, 10 feet sea level rise and, 110 degree heat in Canada and so on. So I think we will avoid the worst of it. But the climate change is here and it's going to keep changing. I'm sure the wildfire stuff we haven't heard the end of, and the hurricane stuff we haven't heard the end of, but we are going to stave off the worst of it.
Another way to stay with the hope for everybody who's still on this call is to visit planetnewcanaan.org. Support the planting of native trees in New Canaan to replace those we've lost to storms, and also support our native plant sales just in time for gardening season. I want to leave it there. Unfortunately, we have to, but please contact David at his email. Thank you once again, David Pogue. Tremendous, so great. Everybody check out this book. Thank you to New Canaan Library, and good night, everyone. Be well.
Thank you so much.